I'm going to be very pleased to introduce to you our visiting scholar in residence in the Communication Leadership Program. For those of you who aren't familiar with our program, we're in our 5th year here at the university. It's a master's program that builds on both our organizational leadership tradition that we've had, and it's part of the communication arts where students are moving beyond bachelor's degree into master's degree work. And so we've had the pleasure over the last several years of bringing a visiting scholar to campus each year. And it has enriched the life of the university, the discussion of ideas, the questions that matter to us, and the questions we hope our students could come out of here really exploring and understanding and trying to make a difference in the world. Our degree is about communication, and as communication scholars, we're most interested in how do we make positive change in our world. So the visiting scholars have been part of that process, and I'm very pleased to introduce you tonight to Dr. John Pauly. John's standing a little bit close to me because we have a funky microphone situation. He's wearing one microphone that's being taping the event that's going out on closed circuit television around the state and going to other places, and that his microphone has to pick me up talking to him right now. It's a little odd, but we're working it out. One thing about Gonzaga, we're nothing if we're not flexible, right? So we're very flexible about that. But I have the good fortune of knowing Dr. John Pauly for the last 15 or 18 years, and I met him as a colleague through the Jesuit Conference of Universities that spanned the globe. Part of the outreach of the Jesuits is really to go out and be of this world and make a difference. And I met John through something called the AJCU, the Communication Conference of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities. And an interesting thing about John, before I give you some of his real background, is he's a lot like me in some ways. He might not see it. I do. I think I would kind of refer to him as a contrarian, meaning if you say something you think, he'll say, "What? Well, why do you think that?" Or some research seems to contradict that. Or and it's like, how come that's true? And so it's a lot of my own behavior when I come across information, I come across stuff about my field and what matters is, well, I just don't want to go there hook, line, and sinker. I want to go, I got the hook, now let me see where it goes. And for that, at yearly meetings, I would be in rooms where John would be present, and after somebody gave a presentation, John, who seems fairly quiet, would eventually raise a question, or that's an interesting way to think about it. Have you ever thought that? And it's his method, really, of walking people through another wisdom, another way that, from his perspective, we haven't thought too much in our world and about communication in particular. But let me say a few formal things about John. I've written these down because I always want to make sure I honor the person who we're coming, not just from my personal perspective and why I value that person so much, but why we choose them as a visiting scholar. What is it that they bring from their history that really can make a difference in our conversations? We titled this lecture series, Thinking Out Loud. It's our opportunity to sort of push forward new ideas. And so let's just start that John is currently the provost of Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now that provost is kind of a weird place to see John at, but I'm happy that he chose it. It's a leadership position that makes a whole lot of difference for the people at Marquette. Prior to assuming his role as a provost, so John served as the dean of the Dietrich College of Communication at Marquette, which is in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He specializes in the history and sociology of mass media and the theory and practice of literary journalism. And cultural approaches to communication research is one of his specialties. He's worked around the country at several universities before he finally ended up. He couldn't find a steady job. No. John progressed from being at East Carolina University and then North Carolina University. Eventually, he made it into the Jesuit Conference at Fordham University. But he segued over to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And then really where I know him the most from is his life as a professor at St. Louis University in St. Louis, Missouri. And these days, John is calling Marquette his home university. John received his bachelor's degree in Science of Journalism with honors in 1972, a Master of Science in Journalism in 1974, and a PhD in communication in 1979, all from a little state university called the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. It's actually quite a massive place. It's one of the best in our field. I'm pleased that John could come from that setting to here. John's published more than 80 scholarly journal articles, book chapters, reviews, essays, and made numerous presentations in our field, both at academic professional organizations, but also in many other kinds of contexts where he served as a consulting capacity. And he's actually well known for his excellence in teaching. That's always the hard step when you move out of the teaching role and decide, for a while, I'm going to guide programs. So his students miss him, but that's why he's here. It was giving him an opportunity to come and teach our students for a while, get a sense about what we do, but actually push forward a couple of his ideas. I have to say that I'm quite honored, and I hope all of you will be too, having John here as our visiting scholar, and thank him very much for coming. We're honored to have you, John.
Thank you, John. Wasn't sure where John was going with that resemblance between us, although I think it actually there is a lot to that. I've known John, as he mentioned, for 15 or 18 years, and these communication conferences we have in the summer are just wonderfully lively places and different from any other kind of academic conference that we engage in. I wanted to thank John and Heather Crandall for the invite to come here. I think Gonzaga is for me a special place. I've been here a couple of times before. I love Gonzaga, I love Spokane. I admire the work that John does in his program and what you do in communication in your journalism programs. And honestly, it's been a delight to be able to be a full-time teacher for 3 days. And so I want to give a special thanks to the students in my Ethics of Popular Culture class for 3 days of smart and very energizing discussions. Now, one of the things that's interesting about being a dean or then now a provost is that when you're a faculty member, you have a lot of opinions about what deans or provosts should do. And then they all come back to haunt you at some point. And one of mine had always been that I thought that every academic administrator ought to teach a course, because in part it would keep us out of meetings, as we would actually have something productive that we were doing with our time, and that would change our perspective. And I still probably think that, although it's hard to squeeze it in now, especially as provost. So one of the challenges is for an academic administrator that actually, as I tell people, I'm responsible ultimately for the, or at least accountable for, the quality of the student's academic experience in all fields at Marquette University. And it's a little bit hard to do that well without actually being in the classroom and having that connection. So for me to be able to renew myself in this way the last few days has been fantastic. The title of my talk is a little bit puzzling, perhaps, or unpredictable. And so the brief version of it, what I'm going to talk about, perhaps, is what it takes not only to be a good person, that is not only to live by our ideals and our ethics, but what it takes to make our ideals count, or the challenges to making them count, and what it, in particular, in these organizations within which so many of us work today. Now, this is a little bit of an extension of what we've been doing the last few days in the popular culture course. Because one of the starting points of that popular culture course was to notice that in American society and all over the world, in fact, there is a discourse about the media. The media are treated as characters in our talk about ourselves and our society. And a lot of the weight of that talk has traditionally fallen on popular culture, particularly to the extent to which those practices were thought to be shallow, trivial, commercial, and unworthy. So in a kind of cultural studies spirit, what we've tried to do the last few days is to say that even when there are things that you dislike about popular culture, there's something meaningful going on there, and that at the end of the day you can be as critical of it as you want, but it's probably a good idea to try to make sense of why it matters to people. One dimension at least, that we didn't talk about too much the last few days, however, is that organizations figure in our lives very differently now than they did 100 years ago or so. So it's not just the case that in our moral and public imagination of one another that it's populated by individuals or groups, It's also populated by organizations. We have an image of Walmart and an image of the New York Times. We think about the National Football League or the Catholic Church. These are all richly meaningful characters and part of our moral imagination of the world now. You see this, if you look internally in an organization, in the kinds of discussions it has about its own mission and identity. Because discussions of mission and identity are presumably about what we stand for, what it is that marks us off as distinctive, what are the values that we're going to honor in our work, regardless of what happens day to day. A lot of this has become talk about branding, and if you were to read the emerging literature on branding, you would see that commentators say this is not just about the products that companies sell externally, but it's also about how you drive the sense of mission in your internal organizational decisions. So there's this very self-conscious moment we're at in the history of organizations where there's a lot of study and reflection on what makes each of our organizations special. We do this in part because in commercial organizations and businesses, we want to have a market niche. But we also recognize that there's a kind of yearning for this for a lot of people, that we want to recruit and retain the kind of people who share the perspectives that we share. The external component of this, of course, is that people are watching that process all along, and especially the press and other media are watching it. So it's not just that there are organizations having these branding and mission issues, that we're making movies about organizations that lose their way. We have newspaper reporters reporting on changes that happen in organization. And there's always this aura of ethical or moral deliberation, or if not deliberation, at least reflection that accompanies these discussions. So we've come to recognize that organizations at one level are the sites of ethical decisions and choices. They are the stages for moral drama. That is, the kind of challenges and ethical dilemmas we faced, in some sense, are enacted within organizations, and that becomes one of the places we go to think through those challenges. And interestingly, they become characters in our dramas. So the investment house, formerly known as Bear Stearns, was a place where ethical choices were made or unmade or sidestepped. It was a place where employees who are faced with those challenges anticipated the consequences for themselves, for their organizations, for their individual careers. And when Bear Stearns fails, it becomes, the company becomes a character in an ongoing narrative about society's ethics. So what I want to try to do is to call our attention in this brief way, and I love the idea that I'm talking aloud because this is fairly new terrain. These are ideas I haven't written about very much, but have been much on my mind the last couple of years. I want to call attention to the relational density and complexity of the organizations we've created and ask whether our usual approaches to ethics really do justice or capture that complexity well enough, or give us the kind of guides that we think that we need to live humane lives in peace and service to one another. And whether in fact these organizations offer us the opportunities for creativity and hope that we would like them to. I thought I would pose the challenge a little bit starkly at the beginning by calling your attention to a story that appeared yesterday in USA Today on the front page. The headline of the story was, "Pentagon Ignored Humvee Warnings." What the Pentagon's own Inspector General found, and published in some reports in the mid-90s, was that Humvees are poorly protected against roadside bombs. We've known this since 1994. The military's reports call for development of mine-resistant vehicles, but until fairly recently that hasn't happened. According to John Pike of globalsecurity.org, quote, "The Pentagon didn't develop such a fleet because championing the vehicles wasn't seen in the 90s as a good career move. The military had spent hundreds of millions on Humvees, and drawn-out ground wars were seen as a thing of the past," he said. This is one of those stories that just tears your heart to read it. But when you read it a second time, you realize that for as stark and dramatic a story this is, it's not that different from a lot of the organizational dilemmas we regularly find ourselves in. If this were a Hollywood movie, we would be looking for a hero in the Pentagon. In other words, somebody who would be able to blow the whistle. We would be condemning the failure of moral courage of people who are unwilling to jeopardize their careers. And yet we know, because of the organizations we work in, that there is more texture and nuance there. The kind of dramatic, ethical choice that's possible in a Hollywood movie is not possible or seems quite as plausible in our everyday behavior. Just to give you a couple of examples of what's at work in that story, if you wanted to unpack it a little bit. A lot of our organizations are somewhat hierarchical. They have a chain of command, and especially in the military, there is a high premium placed on obeying orders and honoring the chain of command. In fact, the work of the military couldn't be done without that kind of commitment. And this is not entirely a bad thing. It's one of the things that people in the military take very seriously. So it's not such an easy question just to blow the whistle on people who you've been trained, whose lives you've been trained to share so deeply. We're also reminded that we talk a lot in organizations about loyalty, but that we have multiple loyalties. So in this case, one loyalty is to the chain of command and to a decision that's already made. And it's sometimes hard to step out of that social group and figure out how to enact a loyalty to some other kind of social responsibility. We all know that once an organization has made a decision to go in a particular direction, there feels like there's a great deal of momentum, and that the organization in some ways stops listening to alternatives. In other words, that it's, even if you were very passionate about this and made a big deal about it, it's not necessarily that blowing the whistle would have done very much. Those organizational investments and choices are sustained by myth and narrative. And so the organization convinces itself that this isn't a big problem with Humvees because, after all, we're not going to be using them that much. We're not going to be involved in ground wars anymore. And so if Humvees aren't entirely adequate, this is a cost that they're willing to bear, especially after Somalia. And then finally, we're reminded in the fact that this is a story commented on, in some ways made public by globalsecurity.org, that we now live in a world in which organizational decisions, even when private, find all sorts of new ways to be made public. That sooner or later, the things that we decide in organizations come under the scrutiny of internal watchdogs, journalists, bloggers, and advocacy groups. So none of that is a defense of what happened in the Pentagon. It's an awful story. It's a real moral failure in many ways. But it would be tough, from my perspective, to say that that moral failure is different from the moral failures in a lot of our contemporary organizations. I mean, the structure of the events looks somewhat similar. It's situations like these, I think, that make us aware of the inadequacy of some of the assumptions that we bring to the study of ethics. And I think this is an important thing for people in Jesuit universities to think about. When we teach, and again, this is slightly oversimplified perhaps, and my apologies to philosophers in the room. But there is a way that we imagine the practice of ethics as happening at a moment of decision. So we think that our narrative, our story about ethical behavior, is that there is a moment when we confront clear choices and we're asked to choose one or the other. We arrive at a fork in the road. We like to think, if we've been educated in moral and religious traditions, that we bring to every situation some principles that help us choose a line of action, and that those principles stand apart from any of the particular social contexts in which we hope to apply them. So we study ethics, and then and our hope is that whether we go into medicine or business or journalism, in any of those cases, those ethical principles still stand us well. We tend to think that this ethical work is done in advance. So we encounter new situations. We have a group of ethical principles and ways of making a choice that we've learned, and that the choice is made when we first encounter the situation. If we were studying this, though, from a rhetorical point of view, a lot of times what we would say is that sometimes ethics is a way of talking about what we did retrospectively after we made some kind of choice in order to make it intelligible to others. Okay? Why did you do that? And so there is a bit of storytelling that goes on there. So in a way, we've assumed that all the work of ethics happens before the decision. But from a rhetorical point of view, a lot of that work of ethics happens after as a way of explaining what we did to others. And then finally, we put a lot of faith in agency. That is, we think that if we train ethical people, they have the power to decide and to make choices. So for me, the situation described in USA Today is typical in its ambiguity, especially in these large-scale organizations that we're talking about. Humans find themselves in situations that are very fluid, overdetermined, that is, subject to multiple constituencies, causes, possibilities, driven by an increasing number and range of internal and external stakeholders who have an interest in the decision, punctuated by some moments of action, but more often a matter of continuous mutual adjustments. A modern version of perhaps of Arendt's notion of the banality of evil, the small acts, bureaucratic acts by which evil is enacted in the world. And in the end, it's a little bit like the almost entirely misinterpreted Robert Frost poem, Two Roads Diverged in a Wood, where it really, when you read Frost carefully, doesn't make a difference. It's hard for us to know the difference that our choices honestly make sometimes. What I'm trying to argue, I think, is that the work of ethical choice making doesn't occur in a private or individual sphere so much. That the real challenge for us is to make it work in these organizations that employ so many of us. You may or may not know this. There's a certain urgency to this, that about half of all Americans who don't work on farms now work in organizations of 500 employees or more. This is a dramatic change in American life since the Second World War. There were hints of this change. If you go back to the sociology and popular culture of the 1950s, in works like The Organization Man and The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, you see that Americans were very clear in their own minds that something was afoot. Something was changing in American life, and that in some ways this was going to be the new mode of employment. If you look for a moment at the current economic crisis, the failure of businesses has been a moral as well as financial failure. Would that we could attribute it to greedy executives and be done with it. There's a very good story in the latest Fortune that talks about how difficult it's going to be to actually get criminal indictments against a lot of the people who behaved and mismanaged their companies. Because unless you can prove that they lied or deliberately deceived, it's going to be hard to make the case. So it wasn't just a matter of greedy executives, but rating services failed us. Auditors, public relation advisors, and the business journalists who covered these organizations. And there was a certain amount of self-delusion all around in each of those professions that made it possible. So in situations like this, the failures don't seem to be individual failures entirely. Because if it was, we could do what we always do, which was we could scapegoat the victim, sacrifice them, and redeem ourselves. But the failures seem like systems failures in many respects. Failures built into the very structure and routines of the organizations that we work in. And so the question is, well, given our ideals, given our ethical and moral principles, which matter so deeply to us and we want to guide our behavior, how do we figure out a way to give them any practical weight in these kinds of modern organizations within which we work? Even in Jesuit universities, where we're so deeply and honestly committed to such ethical work, I sometimes feel that we're a little bit naive about this. That in a sense we practice a version of virtue ethics, or this is what we preach. In the sense that we spend so much time cultivating our young men and women and putting them in educating them in these modes of thinking, that we assume that that'll take care of it. That is, that we do that work and we send them out into the world and wish them good luck, and we imagine, as we say at Marquette, that they will be the difference, that they'll make the difference in their jobs that they have. Now, there's enough truth in that and enough evidence of it to sustain us. So I know that when I meet alumni, and I suspect I would find this if I talk to Gonzaga alumni or alumni of a lot of Jesuit universities, that they look back at their time at a Jesuit university and they recognize that there was some transformative moment there, that they were bequeathed a moral gyroscope, a sense of ethics that made them stand out in their organizations and that served them well throughout their careers. Of course, one of the people who told me that was one of our alums who is the Director of Corporate Communication for AIG. I don't doubt that he believes it entirely, and he seems an extraordinarily decent and honorable person, but it's clear it didn't make a difference in that case. So this kind of education increases the chances of making good choices, but it doesn't fundamentally change the social processes. And honestly, if there are a sociologist in the room, and maybe there is, a sociologist would say, organizations change people much more than people change organizations. That weight of the group and inertia is typically quite powerful, and it's not so easy to be the agent that overcomes it. I thought I'd just say briefly how I came to such a gloomy perspective on the world. It's not really. I'm trying to work towards something more positive here, but I came actually to the study of organizations through the study of media, because there came to be an important moment in journalism studies, for example, in the 1970s, where instead of just examining texts or letting journalists describe on their own what they did and then taking their word at face value, that we actually began to have dozens and dozens of sociologists going into newsrooms, and they examined actually the work that journalists do and the choices that they made. So this is work identified with people like Herbert Gans, Gay Tuckman, the Toronto group. And the assumption there is the premise is, let's figure out why news is the way that it is. Well, it turns out that unless you're committed to a kind of ideological explanation of the media, the weight of the evidence seems to be ideology doesn't actually count for all of that much in the day-to-day operations of news organizations. And most reporters would tell you something like that too. They're too busy to have many ideologies. The idea that at some point they all get into a room and figure out which stories are liberal, which are conservative, which they're going to run, just doesn't work. The work is done at an extraordinary pace. It's done in a very hierarchical organization. It's done within very narrow assumptions about what counts for a story. It's done in competition with other people in the newsroom and as well as against other news organizations. One place after another, you just find one constraint after another in these newsroom studies that help to explain why news comes out the way that it was. And at the end of the day, one of the things that we discovered by the 1990s is that in a journalism profession that commits itself to civic life and democracy and freedom and public discourse, those news organizations come to be disconnected from the very groups they hope to serve, in part because of their very own professional routines. It becomes possible to think of journalism that succeeds as a professional accomplishment, but a democracy that fails. So it's not at all clear that journalism, this has been one of the ongoing debates now for about 15 years in journalism, it's not clear whether journalism, even when it's operating at its best, serves us particularly well in our own civic purposes. Just to give you one really small example of this from the last few days. The Tom Daschle resignation. The typical reaction to the Tom Daschle resignation is to figure out how this damages Obama's credibility, to match up what he says now against what he said in the campaign, to see if this is going to empower the Republicans to fight back a little bit more on legislation. And the one question not really raised very much is the question that citizens have, which is, well, what the hell are we going to do about health care now? Right? Now, to its credit, the New York Times ran a pretty good sidebar on that next to like the first day story it ran on the Daschle resignation. But this is the thing this is the investment citizens had in Tom Daschle's appointment until we found out about this, that this was somebody who had a possibility of actually producing a healthcare system that would be similar to the healthcare systems of other advanced nations of the world. So has been found out a lot in these studies. What matters to citizens disappears because these organizational pressures are so powerful. Now, there's journalists performing for each other, being caught in their own routines, wanting to be the smartest guy in the room, wanting to be the witty pundit on TV. That the things that matter to the citizens, which are much simpler very often, get caught up in all of this insider baseball that journalists play with one another. There's a similar story I found in some work I've done over the last few years with a colleague in public relations. One of the interesting things, and this story hasn't been written if anybody wants to do some research on it, but there hasn't been a good history yet of the reputation of public relations. When you first examine this, you would think, what other profession would have a better title for itself? That is that it's public, that's one of the God terms of American life, and it's relational, and who in communication would object to that? And yet we know that it's one of the most discredited professions in terms of its public reputation. But what's interesting to me is that it's inevitable, that as public relations flourishes and continues, because all of these modern organizations need boundary spanners. That is, they need people who are posted on the edge of the organization, dealing with all of the different stakeholders. And those are investors, those are employees, those are stockholders, they're journalists, they're regulators, they're consumers. There's just a lot of relational work that all big organizations have to do. And that's why public relations is here, and that's why it's never, ever going to go away, I think. So trying to figure out, well, how do you make public relations as good as it can be or make it better within the kind of limitations it has, knowing that it has this kind of terrible reputation, some of which is earned and deserved. One of the things that would be good is if public relations could represent, we're used to saying that public relations is a two-way street, that it represents the organization to the public, and then it represents the public within the organization. And it's really that second function that's the more difficult one. That is, to be the person within the organization who's willing to stand up and say that this is wrong, we can't do this is not who we say we are, this is going to be what happens if we go ahead with this. Now, I honestly know a fair number of public relations people who do that work in a very tactful and discreet way. But there's an ongoing discussion right now in public relations about whether practitioners are up to this. That is, whether they're compromised a little bit by the nature of the promotional aspects of their role, whether they're really people who are organizationally situated to help in a way that would help their organizations be socially responsible. So all of this is to say that I didn't come to organizational communication as a scholar of organizational communication at first, but rather by noticing how important these organizational issues were in the study of the mass media. Now, lest you think that these are problems, again, that can be solved if we just get rid of corrupt and morally obtuse and dishonest people, in some ways they're built into the very structure of our contemporary organizations. So the scale of organizations makes it virtually impossible to know the whole organization simultaneously. I learned this within my first 2 weeks of being provost, that the range of things going on in the colleges is just exceptional. And we're not even that big an organization by a lot of standards, a couple of thousand employees. So I'm constantly, as the person in charge of doing all of this, finding somebody who says, oh, we have this program or we have that program, and I knew nothing about it. And they're wonderful programs. And so I think to myself, well, if this is good stuff we're doing, well, then what kind of bad stuff is going on that nobody actually tells me about? The stakes of the decisions that we make are just exceptional. So all of us in higher education are going through this moment now where we don't know whether we're going to make our freshman class next year. The signs of Marquette are pretty good. We're up 17% in our applications. Our endowment's off, but we put aside extra money for financial aid. We think it's going to be okay, but honestly, we're waiting on 18-year-olds and their parents to make decisions over the next 3 months. Even coming in a little bit short of goals in higher education right now in this season can mean cutbacks and have profound consequences. So Beloit College, a fine small liberal arts college in Wisconsin, comes up 40 students short this last year in their freshman class and lays off 10% of their employees. In these kind of administrative jobs like I have or in any organization, you become aware of how much is at stake. Not only the prosperity of the organization, but the lives of all of the families of your employees who are implicated in the organization's success. We constantly act without certain knowledge. That is that there's virtually no way to have all of the information or all of the knowledge we need to make complete choices. We operate with a mystifying array of stakeholders, and new stakeholders, new constituencies come to the fore every day. And we constantly operate through the veil of our own mythical beliefs. One of which is very often that if we get the right leader, everything goes away. That is that the charismatic leader comes in, changes it, hires the right people, and that all of these kind of battles that have been going on in the organization for years get ameliorated or disappear. So what I thought in beginning to conclude now is just I would leave you with one example of this that actually comes from Jesuit universities. It's a modest example, but I think it's revealing and in a lot of ways typical. And this is the obsession of American universities the last several years, especially with rankings and ratings and reputation. Now, reputation is a good thing by almost any measure. Reputation means that we do things that other people recognize and honor and think are good. It means that we have customers who value what we offer them. It means that our name stands for something. So for our alums, they're very proud of having been a Marquette or a Gonzaga alum because that means something in the world. It becomes a kind of coin of the realm in higher education. It enables us to do better in the people that we hire. It positions us better for getting grants and gifts from alumni and others. So reputation is what economists would call a positional good. It's a kind of status that we work very hard to gain. And we always hope to do it on the right terms. It's also a way of responding to marketplace pressures, especially at so many of our schools because we're tuition driven. So reputation is a way of securing our niche in the marketplace, making sure that we bring in our classes and pay the bills every year. And we take every advantage that we can to try to improve that reputation and to sustain what we're doing. Sometimes this discussion of reputation reflects an honest desire to tell a story. So it's not so much when we do a lot of this marketing and communication that we're just bragging on ourselves. I mean, there's a lot of that, and maybe a little bit too much. But honestly, people who go to our universities love our universities, and they want to stay in touch, and they want to share. So it's a little bit like with our moms. You don't write, you don't call, tell me what's happening. The only Catholic with a Jewish mom. People honestly want us to share news of our accomplishments with them. And that's very much the way they hear it. And because alumni are such an important constituency, to maintain our reputation as universities is to constantly invest in the quality of the degrees that we've given to those students, and to guarantee that those degrees continue to have value decades into the future. Those are all wonderful things that come from paying attention to reputation. But there are a lot of other things going on as well. In part, we've gotten into this debate about reputation because of a historical change in American universities. Before the Second World War, a much smaller number of Americans went into universities. And when they did go, they were entering a system of education that was very much marked by class. So in some ways, our styles of liberal education were more plausible up till the Second World War, not because people were more appreciative of liberal education, but because if you came from a well-to-do family with social connections, regardless of what kind of degree you had, you would probably move into your social networks and into a job. From my perspective, as the son of a father who went to night school for 11 years so that he could become, instead of a foundryman, become a vocational teacher in a Chicago high school, and whose act of sacrifice in doing so raised his, the well-being of his entire family, the democratization of the American university since the Second World War has been an entirely good thing. It's been a good thing for minorities, it's been a good thing for women, and it's been a good thing intellectually for us as well. But it does create more of a scramble for position and reputation. So in some ways, what we're trying to do constantly is to distinguish ourselves at the very moment when we should perhaps be honoring the fact that we've done so well across the board, that there are good universities in the United States from coast to coast now. Another difference, and this is one we're familiar with, is there's a whole new series of commercial arbiters of education, of reputation. And so U.S. News is the most obvious example of it. But I had my director of institutional research show me the other day a list of the surveys that we fill out, and there's something like 30 a year. So they come from Forbes magazine and all kinds of different places. And these are ways in which magazines, publications, try to cash in on the kind of general interest in universities and parents' concerns about where they should invest their money and where they should send their kids. So all sorts of external organizations now have a stake in our internal debates about reputation. And we're constantly having discussions in our universities about how we'll look if we don't answer a particular survey, or what the implications of that might be. These are organizations that are paying attention to us in order to promote their own publications, or sometimes in a new survey the Chronicle has, to gather market research for their own purposes and their own consulting. Given that we all have departments of organization, offices of marketing and communication, there are now groups within our organizations who pay very close attention to every little bit of, who now take reputation management as a great deal of what they do, as their purpose in the organization. And so even if the provost or the president expresses a little bit of skepticism about whether this is a good thing to fill out the 32nd survey in the last 6 months, there's always a little bit of organizational pressure to do so. The choices made on one issue get folded into a narrative that gathers up other issues and starts to become a pattern. So if I say, do we really need to do another one of these? I have to be conscious that my decision or my choice or my talking about that gets bundled into other observations that people have made about my administrative style, and becomes part of a story that people begin to tell about my effectiveness or not as a provost. Service to reputation is such an important thing that it's likely to be emphasized by people like university presidents. And I work for an exceptional man, Bob Wild. And so this is more a general observation than anything about Father Wild. But presidents, like every one of their, in general, want to make sure that everybody's rowing in the same direction, that we're all contributing to the good of the university. And so there is a lot of internal performance in big organizations. People making sure that, that everybody sees who's trying to do the best to improve the reputation of the organization. So even in a Jesuit university, some of that space for discernment and ethical deliberation starts to get collapsed when different departments are trying to push this. I didn't put this in my talk, but I just thought of this. I had an uncle who started the pipe coverers union in Chicago in the 1920s, Uncle Huey Mulligan. And even into his 80s, Uncle Huey Mulligan would take the pipe coverers on a retreat. And the big point of the retreat, the kind of centerpiece of it, was the Stations of the Cross. And so Uncle Huey would move kind of slowly from one to another. And a certain number of people would walk through every station with Uncle Huey. But the minimum was that if you were a journeyman or especially an apprentice, that you had to make sure that Uncle Huey saw you at some point during the Stations of the Cross. And so you'd have people, they'd be out at the car and they'd be drinking beer. Oh, Huey's going to be at station number 7. And so then they would run to station number 7 to make sure that they got in eyesight of Uncle Huey. There's a lot of that that goes on in our organizations. It's not just that people do well, but that they constantly they're very conscious of performing well. That is, making sure that other people notice that they're doing good things, or that they're affirming what they take to be the common sense wisdom of the organization. Reputation, of course, continues to be an object of value, a coin of the realm I called it before, and sometimes becomes hard to manage. And so a lot of faculty now, especially faculty at research universities, seem more and more like independent contractors. And I'm the last person to complain about this with all of the universities that I've taught at. In other words, that the career path in higher education seems to favor people who have strong research backgrounds. You get more choices about where you want to go. And reputation becomes the basis for hiring really outstanding researchers, grant getters. There's a similar kind of career path that operates in administrative careers. In other words, that administrators, people who want to go from department chairs to deans to provosts to presidents, make very conscious decisions based on reputation about what kind of school is going to move them to the next level. In these kind of discussions about reputation, the invocation of mission comes to be a kind of moral trump card. So people try to take whatever they think they want to do, and they kind of disguise it as a discussion of mission, and then put it out there as to say, well, this is obviously what we should do. So in all of these ways, we're involved in this world of reputation, the seeking a reputation, in a way that can begin to seem unseemly or inappropriate for us, especially in a Jesuit university. It's sometimes hard to know where the world of reputation ends and the world of fame begins. We're conscious of performing ourselves for external audiences, and it's easy to feel that we're losing track of the intrinsic worth of what we do for the sake of doing it. And we find ourselves able to believe in the value of human beings and the work that we do with young men and women, and yet also affirm the importance of putting 20-year-old male basketball players' images on the arena jumbotron. So what can be done about this? Well, this is the moment where you're going to be really disappointed in this talk. Because I don't have any solutions that are nearly as robust enough to respond to the challenges that I've posed. The things I'm going to suggest, and I'll suggest 3 things, pale in comparison to the task. But I do think they're meaningful, and I do think they'd make a difference. So the first thing is that I think it's important to encourage the direction that philosophical discussions of ethics have taken, especially over the last 20 or 30 years, which is to more dialogical ways of thinking about ethics. So ethics not so much as an outcome or the right choice as opposed to the wrong choice, but ethics as the word we use to signify our commitment to constant moral struggle. In other words, to a kind of self-awareness and a willingness constantly to encounter the world and come to terms with it. A lot of you probably know a notion offered by Martin Buber, a description of dialogue, in which he says that a dialogue is a kind of third space or a bridge. So you bring two people together, you have one position, you have another, and then there's a kind of third space that gets created in an effective dialogue. For me, ethics should inhabit that third space. I think it would be good to the extent to which we can make organizations commit to having discussions. That is, literally as part of their routines, to set aside some time for deliberation and discernment. I think we're doing a better job of this in Jesuit universities. I think our mission offices and most Jesuit universities now try to create those kind of spaces for administrators and faculty, and I, for my own part, found that very satisfying. The challenge is to routinize that. It is not to make it seem voluntary, not to make it seem like an add-on, but for organizations to have leaders who say that that has to be built into the very structure of everyday work. And then finally, I think it would be good for us to think through in our systems of Jesuit education what I would call organizational savvy. That is to recognize that for all the good work we've done to prepare young men and women to be ethical, that we also have to prepare them to work in the organizations that they're going to find themselves in, and to be able to navigate the complexity that I've been describing. To begin, even while in school, to feel the weight of some of those decisions. I continue to think that Jesuit education's one of the best paths, one of the best higher education educational traditions, because we have Jesuit middle and high schools as well. One of the best educational traditions for preparing young men and women for this organizational world. I think our commitment to caring, to discernment, to personal, intellectual, and ethical excellence is going to continue to matter a great deal, but I would say that it's not going to be a guarantee of anything. Thank you.
We'll open up for about 10 minutes of questions. We might have to repeat your question. It's being taped up there, but I'd be glad to take questions. 1, 2, yeah?
Thank you, Professor. You're questioning traditional ethics as we understand them in the context, as I understand you were talking about, in the context of organizations, particularly or specifically the universities, based on its existing dependence on reputation.
Mm-hmm.
So you seem to be proposing to me a critical theory of ethics, and whereby, and a democratization of ethics, whereby the individuals and participants of the organization participate in that discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Where then do you see the beginnings of ethics? Is it in the does the organization begin it, or do the individuals in the organization decide? And if they do, how can that translate to outside of the organization?
Wow.
Could
yeah.
you be part of the question so the taping will...
Yeah, so I mean, so your point is, I did a little bit of a critique of ethics, and I talked about how difficult some of these discussions of reputation are. And so if we really want to have a more, I'm going to use the word robust, but I mean, if we want to have a more lively and robust system of ethics, does that work fall to the organization or to the individual?
Yeah.
That kind of thing? All right. I think it has to be both. So organizations have to welcome the discussion, and so if organizations want to hire ethical people and people with principles, they have to invite that in their attitude, and they have to think that through. So we know this in discussions of diversity in our organizations. That is, if we want to have diverse organizations, it's not enough just to bring different people to those organizations, but we have to figure out how to change ourselves to make those organizations comfortable to people who haven't shared our work life. And then the individual part, ideally there will be organizations who want people who have that ethical compass or that commitment. And I think a lot of this, again, is just this more dialogical approach to ethics does a lot of that work because it brings those two things together. I was always impressed with Nell Notting's work because she says a lot of the way we think about ethics traditionally is the judgment of the father, right? This is right, this is wrong, you should do this, you shouldn't do that. And for her, caring was a different kind of ethic because it was more deeply relational. So that if others matter to us, if we feel implicated in their lives and we take that seriously and respect them as fellow humans, then it's a kind of mutual obligation to create the space where it's possible for all of us to act humanely. So.
Good. Second question here.
On a little more practical level,
Yeah.
given the ethics of change and the inability to change a massive organization like Washington government, was it hopelessly naive of a charismatic politician like Obama to suggest that he could change, and was the media gullible, were the media gullible in not challenging that ability to change more?
I think journalists have been laying in wait, lying in wait, because I think journalists tend to be a skeptical lot, and I think they have mixed feelings about somebody like Obama, because like there's a little human part of them. That's a terrible thing to say, like the journalists aren't human. No, but I mean there's a little part of journalists that wants to hope, right, and to believe that the world can get better. But journalists have a profession in which people constantly lie to them. And so like a lot of professions where that's true, like police officers, day after day, in some ways you see people at their worst. And so, just speaking for myself, the most extraordinary thing about this campaign was the tone of it. In other words, that it's not okay anymore just to be in one another's faces, to be angry. You know, that's like a political marketing strategy that's not necessarily going to work. It's okay to hope. It's okay to believe in ourselves. It's okay to think that we have the possibility of changing ourselves. And so what's a little bit discouraging the last few days, and there's going to be much more of this, and it's going to get much worse, is that, you know, the guy's hardly been there. The guy probably hasn't unpacked all of his boxes yet. And yet we're looking for referendum on whether his ideas make any sense or not. So.
More questions?
Can you comment on the effect of the internet, the growth of the internet in organizations and people's lives relative to ethics in organizations, and whether it's helped to improve or no change or
Yeah. I think my summary would be it's all up for grabs, buddy. You know, that, a lot of the ethics that we have, like if we're just talking about communication professions, we've developed over a long time. And even when we don't honor them, we know what they are. You know, so in public relations, even though this happens all of the time, the ethical principles, well, you shouldn't have front organizations. Like you shouldn't be a company and go out and make up an organization and then have them say good things about your company and nobody knows that actually they're part of your company. I think organizations feel themselves very susceptible to the internet. They see there are a lot of commercial possibilities, new ways of promoting their products, ways of reducing costs, but there's a lot of ethical slippage right now. I don't know if you heard about this. It was about a year or two ago, this Walmarting Across America blog, because Walmart allows people to put their RVs like in the parking lot for free. And so this guy said, well, you know, wouldn't it be fun like to go from one Walmart parking lot to another and write about this? And it was actually a woman, and her husband was a photographer, and they were going to do this. And this seems like this kind of wholesome American thing, like a road trip from one place to another. Well, Walmart paid for all of this, right? And that's not announced, that wasn't announced on the blog. So this blog that they had about all these different Walmarts they were visiting, turns out the reporter or the photographer is a photographer of the Washington Post, and the Washington Post is not happy about the fact that one of their news photographers is moonlighting on the side doing this. The people who do this at first deny that Walmart is involved in it, and then they have to kind of fess up because all the evidence is there. And most astonishingly of all, the public relations agency that helped sponsor and devise this was Edelman, who's been one of the most vocal people about what the ethics of internet marketing ought to be. All right, so we're going to have like 100 more examples of that. So I think that's always the tension in this. In other words, like the organization simultaneously sees commercial opportunities, marketing, and then there's new kinds of ethical challenges, like with viral marketing. So is it okay if you're a young person in public relations or advertising to get on a blog or website and pretend to be a disinterested third party and talk about what a great product this is, when in fact you work for the organization that sponsors that product?
Sorry, but you've been talking about how it's really not the fault of the journalist whether something like that happens, that they are reporting on a case that did not really happen, or it's kind of false. On the other hand, we do know that there is one TV channel in specific which actually in the past was accounting for giving certain type of messages only, and even the reporters were told you can only talk about this specific topic in this specific wording.
Does it begin with F?
What do you
Yeah.
think of that?
Well, here's, I mean, this is my take, and this is kind of a long-term journalism historian take, is that journalists for years, for centuries now, have tried to figure out ways to make an audience, like to gather an audience. And so at different moments, political party affiliations, that was a way to gather an audience, or to have a strong partisan point of view, like have an editorial voice. And then we entered this long moment in which we thought, in large part because we didn't want to offend advertisers, that a kind of moderated, even-handed professional voice was not only make the reporters seem more professional, more like other professions, but also would be a good thing for business, because you don't go around defending business, your advertisers. In some respects, all that's happened, like with Fox, right. All that's happened with Fox is that we've reinvented another marketing approach to news. In other words, that there is an audience that finds, it's a marketing concept. Partisanship is another marketing concept again. If you watch MSNBC, that's a pretty, I mean, it's a different ideology, but they share a marketing concept in a sense there too. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, because, we were living in a little bit of a fantasy to think that we could depend on professional journalists to just give us an absolute truth that we wouldn't have to fact check and balance against other things as well. So, let's have at it. Let's put it all out there.
But still, it's not ethical to change the messages I'm giving. Like, you need the behavior, and just have a different message then.
Well, it's not if you say that you're living by a like tradition, like professional codes of objectivity, but they don't say that they are. I mean, they make no bones about what they're doing. So.
We have time for a few more questions. Gavin, over here.
I was going to say, with regarding journalism, I remember I read not too long ago statistics such as reporters, and this goes along with advertising, something like 54% of reporters for newspapers and television news have felt pressured to revise or to pull out a story because it is detrimental to one of their advertisers. The fact that newspapers and news channels do depend so much on advertising, is it possible to be ethical 100% of the time if it's mixed in with capitalism and commercialism?
Yeah, we have a couple of professional reporters, former professional reporters in the audience, and so but I will tell you that I hear that observation more now than I did 20 or 30 years ago. In other words, I hear people talk about it more. Reporters seem to talk about it a little bit more. I mean, it's an astonishing thing, because we had like Marxist critics of the news who were saying this 20 and 30 years ago, were being condemned by newspaper people. And now journalists are saying much worse things about their own news organizations than any of those critics ever did. I think a lot of, going back to the organizational studies, a lot of it is this kind of subtle stuff. Like you say, if you're the reporter, it's more like, I got this great idea for a story, and I got a little bit of background on it. I got some great sources, And then the editors sit around and say, well, you know, that's not, I don't know, that sounds a little bit iffy. It's going to take too much time. We're going to have to use you in the political campaign. I don't want you spending any time on this. I need you to spend time on that. So it could be that when 54% of the people say that, that's the kind of situation in part that they're describing, you know. So, but it's very subtle a lot of times. I think it's relatively rare still for an editor to say you can't do that, because then or that's not my ideology or whatever. Because then there's a blowback for the editor. In other words, that all of a sudden you're in the pages of the Columbia Journalism Review and you can't hire reporters, and you find yourself out in a little while. So, but having said that, that's to me a lot of what these ethical decisions in organizations feel like little nudges, suggestions, omissions, rather than like commands.
A few more questions. Anybody else have two? Anybody here want to make sure you get the last chance in? Okay, let's take these two questions. Kathy.
You talked about creating a space within an organization to talk about
Yes.
about ethics and dialogue,
Yeah.
to have that dialogical space. And I'm wondering if you do that. I'm thinking of like my own organization, how that would look. That could be very insular. It seems like you almost have ethics is defined by as much by the society you live in as by the organization you work in. So how do you bring that outside ethic that society commands from us in the organization?
I think that's a good point. You know, there's that, and I would be perfectly agreeable to that. In other words, that you bring in your external stakeholders as well. And so a lot of times we spend time in organizations, and public relations people are charged with doing this, telling people why we're so good and why they ought to like us and why they ought to go along with what we do. And we don't spend enough time listening to what matters to them. And so I think just in terms of that small idea I gave you about creating that space to bring external stakeholders into that would be a fantastic thing.
But you can't talk about the real ethics that are going on. You have to use, it seems to me, a case example of something that went wrong in the organization that highlights the ethics. You can't talk about that with external stakeholders.
Well, there's proprietary issues there. Is that what you're thinking?
I'm just thinking about damaging reputation. I mean, how would this actually look?
Well, that's an interesting thing, right? Because our sense of reputation is, it's like purity. Like, we don't do anything wrong. Everything that we do is good. We're very worried that we can't show our mistakes to anybody, because then that damages reputation. And then we have all kinds of people that we pay a lot of money to who tell us that constantly. Oh, you can't say that because that's going to damage your reputation. Faculty who say, well, you can't post assessment results on the website because we'd be airing our dirty laundry. Like, we'd be telling people, well, so-and-so, or the teaching's not as effective in this department as it could be. Or that's the imputed response. So, but I think a kind of honesty and transparency counts for a lot with people, right? I mean, like to say, we're not perfect. This is what we did. This is what happened. And I find that refreshing. And I think it's a good thing. But, like you're pointing out, it's like moving the rock to convince organizations that, that's the case.
I have a last question up here somewhere. Yep.
You almost answered it there. I was going to ask about, I'm a PR person, by the way.
Yeah.
Don't throw rocks. But to me, I feel like I agree with what you're saying. And who knows, I struggle even in my own profession at times, feeling like there's such an ethical boundary of, but really everybody is a PR person, whether you are the provost of Marquette
Yes,
telling about
absolutely.
the wonderful things of your university, or you're a faculty pitching the wonderful things about this particular theorist you love. I mean, all of us in some way are playing that role
Yeah.
in our lives. But the thing that I struggle with is when I work for a children's hospital, and I struggle with where the line is between telling the good things about what you are at the point where it takes your audience hostage. Where maybe you play on this mom in Kentucky's fears that her child will never grow up to be anything great, so they have to come to a Jesuit education. Or your children are going to be crippled forever if you don't come to our hospital. And that's where, in an organization, as that's a fishy line for me, is where do you find that boundary of, I mean, you're not doing anything wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but is there a line there where you've crossed a line to?
You know, I think, I mean, to your point, you know, and that's maybe a little bit when I was talking about what's a little bit limiting in our traditional approaches to ethics. It's like we've wanted to know where the line is all the time. Like, tell me where I cross the line. You know, I'm good up to this, and then I'm bad after that. So much so that when, you know, like some of the people like Bob Steele and Jay Black, who were involved in early journalism ethics education, you know, Bob Steele at Poynter would have a little list of 10 principles that you'd put in the reporter's desk, so that if, you know, you were making a choice, you would always know. But the thing is, you know, we know, and you could just look at our own family lives, our relations with our parents and with our children, you know, that the world is messy in that way, that we're constantly negotiating it. And we want, at least I want, to work in an organization that honors that fact about us. In other words, that doesn't try to get off the hook by saying, well, we did enough. You know, like the law doesn't require us to do any more, therefore we're not, and therefore you have no reason to criticize us because we did what was legal. Or, well, we decided that this was going to be our way of making it good to the community, and even if the community didn't think that was good enough, it was good enough for us, and we've performed ourselves in a way to get us off the hook. And those are the kind of situations PR people find themselves in. Yeah, just to close, the one here would be the ideal in some ways. That I heard years ago, the late Tom Savage, who was the president of Rockhurst University, came to St. Louis for a Heartland meeting and give a talk. And he said he had flown in on Southwest Airlines. And on Southwest, he happened to sit next to a mechanic who was flying for free. And just trying to make conversation with the mechanic, he said, well, I hear Southwest has some new routes and doing some new stuff. And the mechanic said, oh, absolutely. He said, let me show you what we're doing. And he reaches in, he pulls out the magazine, he goes to the back, he shows the route map, and he spends the next 5 minutes explaining what Southwest is going to be doing to improve its routes and add new routes and so forth. All right. Any organization worth its salt wants to be that kind of an organization, where everybody up and down throughout the organization feel connected to it, feel proud to talk on its behalf, feel that it's responsive to its customers and cares for its employees. So all of this tonight, you know, even being critical of organizations and showing how tall the mountain is to get over, all of this is in the service of trying to make us those kinds of organizations. So.
Thank you. I have a small gift for Dr. Pauly, and it really goes back to a kind of a nightmare PR story that Marquette University has been struggling with. This tells you how serious some of these PR problems are. Those people older in the room might know Marquette as the nickname for Marquette was the Marquette Warriors. And in a conscience of diversity and so on, the university went through a name change, and they worked very hard to come up with a name that could replace the Warriors, and they decided to call themselves the Marquette Gold.
Yeah, for a month or two, we were the Gold.
They were the Marquette Gold for about 1 or 2 months. The uproar from the alumni and the alumni groups had them switch back to the Marquette Warriors, and there is an alumni group who still call themselves Warriors. Now they moved away from that name again.
They were the Golden Eagles.
Now they're the Golden Eagles. So they're not quite sure what they are, but it's been a PR nightmare, alumni, budgeting, funding to come in. So I thought the most important thing, because he has a hard time at his university, is we would make him an honorary ZAG.
Hey, there we go. Fantastic. There we go. Thank you. Worn proudly, too.
And although we
Thank
have
you.
our moments where we call ourselves Bulldogs, ZAG seems to be there.
Thank you,
very
John.
much, Sean.
Thank you.
Everybody.
That was cute.
We've got several things in common. My son goes to Marquette.